Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today we're talking to Dr. Jill Bender, who's an associate professor in the Department of History at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, and she is going to speak about the Irish women's migration during the Irish Famine and also the role of the British Empire in Ireland and how that continues today somewhat. So in addition to being an associate professor, Dr. Bender is currently the Director of Graduate Studies for the History Department. Among other awards and honors, Dr. Bender was named the Trustees Fellow at the National Humanities Center 2019 to 2020 and the Lloyd Distinguished Residential Fellow 2017. So welcome, Dr. Bender, and thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm pleased to be here.
We're very glad to have you. So turning to your particular area of study, generally you describe your area of scholarship focusing on the interaction among a range of British colonies for insight into the mechanics of the 19th century British Empire. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. I think that's a pretty fair, kind of very broad overview of my academic interests. And they really started that particular interest of sort of the connections between disparate colonies within the British Empire.
Right.
Goes back many, many years, even to my high school experience. But I think it mostly started to develop as an undergraduate at the College of William and Mary, where I became quite interested in how, lessons learned in one area, lessons or practices learned in one colonial area could then be applied to another experience or another location. And I was able to really kind of develop those interests even further, and more specifically with relation to Ireland and the British Empire.
Right.
Master's degree in Ireland, and then continued on for my PhD at Boston College. So I'm quite interested in what connects disparate colonies and really, empires as world systems. Power isn't natural. It needs to be constructed and maintained. So what kinds of connections draw together empires or draw together colonies, and how are those power structures, constructed and maintained?
Yeah. So turning more specifically to Ireland, what was the primary role of the Irish in the British Empire? I know that's a complicated question, but you can approach it from any area you'd like.
It is a complicated question, and it's one where the answers have changed, not only as a result of our scholarship, but just they also changed over time. Which is the study of history. Originally, there was a big debate among scholars as to whether Ireland was a colony of the British Empire or not. And I think most scholars have come to the agreement that it probably was the first colony of the British Empire. And it's the Irish contributed, I think, to the British imperial expansion in a lot of different ways. Certainly just by bodies,
right?
As immigrants, men and women, and that started. It really took off in the 18th century. They had long been immigrating, but it really took off in the 18th century and then kind of exploded in the 19th century. As bodies, but also as soldiers, as you mentioned, as missionaries, domestic servants, any number of reasons why Irish individuals chose to seek livelihood across the empire.
Right. I think it's an interesting point that you've also made, is that immigration was an exercise in hope in a lot of ways. I think it's interesting to also remember that they were looking for opportunity, like they were going towards something as well as leaving something behind. So I think that's also important to remember when we think about the Irish experience within the empire.
I think it is important to remember, and I think many a worldview of feeling that you are forced, or exiled, many people have suggested that was kind of the worldview of Irish individuals who came to North America, but not necessarily the experience of Irish individuals who went to New Zealand or to Australia. So there are differences in not just why people are going, but where they're going and how that shapes their experience as well.
It's not all a monolithic immigrant experience as well, that there are different reasons and a lot of different hopes and fears and loss all combined together.
It's important to remember Ireland's proximity to Britain, and that's a
Right.
lot why they were largely involved. I mean, they were, they're right there.
Right.
But also, starting in 1800, Ireland, with the Act of Union, Ireland abolished its parliament and sent members of parliament to the British Parliament. And so they're
Right.
also kind of part of the United Kingdom in a way that other colonies were not in the early 19th century. So in that sense, I think it was quite unique. In other ways, for example, the military, that's certainly a shared experience. If you look at the number of Indian individuals by the end of the 19th century, the Indian Army and the British Army were almost pretty much the same. They fought a lot of Britain's wars. And that continued all the way into World War I and World War II, where a lot of the British Army was comprised of colonized individuals or individuals from the colonies.
A little bit about that and the ways in which maybe the Irish worked against it a little bit more actively if that occurred.
And as I said, with the Act of Union in 1800 or 1801, Ireland and Britain were unified politically or united politically. That doesn't mean that all Irish individuals were happy with those connections. And so
Right.
from there, there's always been individuals who felt that that Ireland was and needed to be recognized as an independent kingdom and a nation.
Right.
And that Irish nationalist cause over the course of the 19th century becomes kind of infused with an anti-imperial cause, where
Right.
originally Irish nationalists were very, I would argue, interested in reshaping their relationship with Britain. Not all of them wanted complete independence or complete separation, but they certainly wanted a reforming of that relationship. And by the end of the 19th century, many Irish nationalists had kind of shifted their attention to be anti-imperial, opposed to the British Empire. Once that shift occurs, that can be adopted or informed by a lot of different colonial experiences. So there's quite a bit of collaboration, for example, between Irish and Indian nationalists by the end of the 19th century.
Right.
And those kind of networks and models really continue all the way into the 20th century.
Right. That's interesting for me to think about. I know that 19th century is really your area of scholarship and focus, but I was just thinking about how when Ireland finally did, or the Republic of Ireland, I should say, actually did achieve independence and then had a civil war and all of that. I was thinking recently about how their nationalism kind of collapsed into a very insular view of Ireland. Like they did not participate in World War II very much at all. And it wasn't just a like, oh, we're neutral. It was more of like, la, 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 like this isn't happening. So they really, so it's interesting to think about how the idea of nationalism changed into anti-imperialism and changed into independence. And then once they achieved independence, changed into something more insular and Ireland first and sort of a focus on a very interior aspect of that. So that was just interesting for me.
Well, I think that those connections of, I mean, in a lot of ways, it's these complexities that for me have made Ireland the most interesting case study, or one of the most interesting case studies to look at within an imperial context, because Ireland was colonized early. And so it became a kind of laboratory for the British, where a lot of different methods of colonization could kind of be worked out,
Right.
cultural or political, economic, or use of land, and then applied to other colonies. And at the same time, as the Irish are more involved in the British Empire, not only does Ireland become a kind of model for methods of colonization, but it also in some ways provide a kind of model for ways to resist the empire as well.
Right.
Models for nationalism. And that, like I said, carries all the way into the 20th century, where you see, there's individuals in India who were not happy with Gandhi's leadership, who looked to Ireland for examples of ways in which violence could shape an anti-colonial narrative or anti-imperial efforts. If you look at partition, I mean, Ireland was partitioned, and you see that as a model for partition in India and Pakistan, or Israel and Palestine. So, you see those models kind of across the centuries.
We had touched a little bit about the role of race in colonialism. I think that you had mentioned this is something that historians have been, if not revisiting, kind of refocusing on a bit, which makes a lot of sense given our current sort of interrogation of a lot of these power structures that seem to be constructed around race and those kinds of ideas. So given that part of the debate around colonialism was a racial one, how has that impacted longer term in Ireland, do you think?
In a number of different ways. Really, during the 1990s, there was a number of arguments to kind of look at whether the Irish themselves were racialized by the British, the roles that sort of racial stereotypes could play both in colonizing Ireland and colonizing other locations. So it's come out in scholarship in that way. More recently, and by more recently, I mean really in the last year or so, there's been a real growing interest in not only Britain, but also Ireland kind of reckoning with its own imperial past. Certainly, Ireland has long reckoned with the impact of empire on its own national narrative and that it was colonized. But more recently, there's been kind of a grappling with the realization that Ireland too participated in the empire and kind of the racial implications of that. Just to give you a couple of examples, one of the most famous Irish nationalists of the mid-19th century, John Mitchell, very, very well-known Irish nationalist, supported slavery. And so then there's kind of the question of, well, how do we come to terms with this individual who argued so vehemently against imperialism, also supported slavery? And so that's something that the Irish and Irish academics are grappling with, and academics of Irish history, and we're not all Irish, are grappling with and trying to understand. Trinity College Dublin is dealing with similar, there have been similar arguments about statues that we see in the United States. We've also seen that across the British Empire, not just in Ireland. And just a recognition that some really well-known Irish individuals did own slaves, some of whom spoke out again against empire, but, benefited from the slave trade, benefited from tobacco, owned slaves themselves. And so, these are complex questions that people are turning to, and I think rightly so. I think it's an important area to look at.
Yeah, I agree. So in your current book project, you're looking more closely into the colonial connections and power relations in the 19th century, but this is specifically towards the migration of Irish women throughout the British Empire. So can you tell us a little bit about that focus of study and how you got to be really interested in that particular aspect?
Sure. Let me start with that, how I got this project, because it actually connects to my first book, which is my doctoral dissertation. So my first book looked at an uprising in India, the 1857 Indian uprising, which was enormous uprising. And what I did is I looked at the impact that uprising had on 4 different colonial sites, New Zealand, Jamaica, the Cape Colony in South Africa, and then also Ireland. And in the process of doing that research, I found this really interesting case study in South Africa where 150 Irish women were sent to marry German soldiers they were the British German Legion. So they were German soldiers they were basically mercenaries who'd been Crimean War by the British. And so I found that case study and I was really fascinated by it, and it didn't make it into the first book, so I set it aside, and then book number 2 has kind of grown out of that particular case study.
This is the Lady Kenny Kennaway, is that right? Yeah.
Yes, the Lady Kennaway group. But one thing that's been really fun and challenging for me, I think the challenge is part of the fun part, is that this book, as it's taking shape, where I examine these kind of assisted migration schemes, so the state was involved in some way to move these women from Irish workhouses to various locations across the British Empire. Looking at that has been a very different kind of research for me.
Yeah.
The way that I often try to explain it or make sense of it to myself and explain it to others is that my first book, in looking at this huge event, it was so big that it was kind of everywhere. So I felt like I was trying to make sense of the haystack. Whereas now, as I'm tracking these individual women who are coming to the house, I feel like I'm looking for the needle.
And I can't imagine workhouses were particularly pleasant places to be, no matter what. So it would make sense if given an opportunity that Irish women would perhaps consider traveling to South Africa on a ship called the Lady Kenaway, which is why that's why I think of it like that. But I think that at first some of the women didn't want to go, actually. Is that accurate? Am I thinking about that correctly?
That's true. That's what I found with the Lady Kennaway case study. The Lady Kennaway case study is kind of an unusual one. That occurred in 1857. It's unusual for a few reasons.
Right.
One, it's a little bit later, 1857. Two, South Africa was not a common destination for Irish immigrants, so the destination was really different. And then three, the fact that some of these women in the end refused to participate in the migration scheme, which I think is really fascinating because it reminds us that these individuals, these women whose voices can be really hard to hear in the archives, had agency. They did make some decisions and they weren't in the system.
A few thousand Irish women who left to go to Australia, who were
the Australian women are they're much better known.
And there seems to be an effort to reclaim that narrative a bit, to kind of reintroduce these Irish women as people who were important to the forming of the nation and the national identity and things like that, who had been kind of written out of the national narrative for various reasons.
That's absolutely true. And in fact, there's this really wonderful monument to the Irish Famine in Sydney in Australia.
Yeah.
It's the Hyde Park Barracks for the Irish Famine, and there's a glass wall, and on the wall are the names of the orphans, of the women.
Right.
I think it's kind of extraordinary. I mean, there's a lot of really wonderful Irish famine monuments across the world, in fact. That's one of the few that highlights the women specifically. Part of what fascinated me is that in all stories of immigration, we sometimes forget about the people who don't go.
Right.
And that's what stood out with me at the Lady Kennaway story, is that 30, 50 women said, no, I don't want to participate. So what happened to them? You know, how does that change the story if you think about those who don't go?
Right. So how did the view of immigration within Ireland change?
By the end of the 1850s,
Right.
And some individuals sort of moving away from migration and supporting it in quite the same degree, especially something like assisted immigration, because so many people had left.
Right.
That there was kind of a desire so many people left and so many people had tragically died. There's a desire to kind of rebuild the country as it is. So in that particular case study, you know, it's assisted immigration. The women were recruited from the workhouses. The poor law guardians who administered the workhouses were part of the recruiting methods. And so when the women refused to go, and they refused to go because there was no guarantee that there would be a priest there to meet them on arrival.
Right.
And so when they refused to go, you see kind of a couple of different reactions. On one hand, the poor law guardians were frustrated. I mean, these women weren't doing what they were supposed to do. And that's quite a common story in female assisted migration stories. They don't always do what they're supposed to do.
Right.
And so you see that, but then you also see people saying, well, maybe we should encourage women to stay here. Maybe we need Irish women to stay here.
Right.
We train them for domestic service or jobs here in Ireland rather than sending everyone away.
Right. It's also a complicated question, but in terms of the legacy of the British Empire in Ireland and generally, this is total pop culture, but I had mentioned to you the interview with Meghan Markle and Prince Harry with Oprah Winfrey that has caused a lot of reverberations and a lot more conversations to come to light about race within the empire and imperialism and the effects of that. And I have read a couple of articles that have been interesting in the suggestion that one of the functions of the British Empire, or how it played out in terms of imperialism and England specifically, was that it was much easier to castigate the actions of the British state in faraway colonies, and that's where the racism existed rather than cope with what was actually happening within England. And but Harry did mention that he felt the criticisms of his wife, Meghan Markle, had colonial undertones in terms of there perhaps needs to be more of a reckoning within England as to the legacy of the British Empire and how that continues today.
And scholars of Ireland have recently kind of grappled with Ireland's imperial past and are doing so. And I mentioned someone like John Mitchell. It's also worth mentioning Frederick Douglass came to Ireland during the famine and was well received and was friends with a lot of Irish nationalists. So it is a very complex.
So interesting, yeah.
You also see with Britain and British history, there's, I think, been a real call, like what you just said, for the British to think a little bit more about the impact of empire on its own shores, and not just this is not just true of Britain, this is true of everyone. It's easier to ignore things like violence or oppression when they take place far away. Right. You know, but that doesn't mean they don't also take place at home. Right. And I think there's a lot of individuals kind of trying to wrestle with that fact, and how do we come to terms with it, and understanding, you know, within Britain, what are the signs of empire? What are the repercussions and the legacies of empire? And how do we make sense of them? And a concern not to whitewash them.
Right. And there have been, you know, obviously with the Black Lives Matter protests of last year, there was a lot of support for that in England and throughout the United Kingdom and throughout the world in many ways. And there were pictures that I saw this morning of a statue being pulled down in Bristol, England, of a slave trader there. So there has been, like we had mentioned earlier, like this scrutiny and this interrogation of these power structures that have been created and perpetuated and maintained, and how to break those down more effectively in a modern viewing of
it. And those efforts are really global. There's been an ongoing effort, I'd say, in Britain to revisit various statues of Cecil Rhodes. The Rhodes Must Fall, and particularly at Oxford, statues there. There have been some statues have been taken down in South Africa of Cecil Rhodes. There's been similar debates in Belgium with King Leopold II, you know, who founded and administered a colony in the Congo, really through violence. Yeah. So these kinds of, you know, debates and arguments and efforts really are global.
Definitely. So what, if anything, have we learned from the experiences of moments of national and international emergency, like the Great Famine, you know, things like that? Because obviously with the COVID pandemic, some of these questions are again arising. So I know it's still ongoing, so I don't know if anyone has a solid answer quite yet, but it has been interesting to see.
It has been, and I don't know that we do have a solid answer. I mean, one thing I frequently tell my students and others is that historians are very, very good at finding patterns in the past, but we cannot predict the future. That's not what we're trained to do. But this has been, it has been an interesting experience, and there's kind of a couple of ways that I can talk about that. One, the history department here at UNCG has started to do kind of very short conversations like what you and I are having right now. And there was one a few weeks ago on studying really plague and pandemics and the Black Death and things in a moment right now, you know.
Yeah.
And what came out of that conversation, I did not participate in it, but I attended it. And I was really fascinated to hear one of the individuals say that this has been a moment of humility for a lot of historians, because we spend a lot of time researching these things, but we haven't really lived them. And so that's been really interesting. And I teach a class on the Irish Famine every fall. And so this past fall, it was really interesting to think about correlations. And sometimes those correlations are just similar questions are being asked. You know, what is the role of the state in relief? Who is being blamed and why? Questions like that you see across time. And a much more personal level, there was a moment of humility for me in that I was scheduled to give a paper in the Netherlands last March, which I obviously had to cancel. And in the paper, I talk about quarantine measures. So it was very interesting to have to cancel a trip where I would talk about quarantine measures as I went into it.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Interesting to see the same kinds of questions come up, you know, so much later, and we still don't really have a good answer. Or
it allows you to reflect on why people made the decisions they did in a slightly different way. And I think that's valuable, you know, because that is really what we're trying to do, is understand why people did what they did, and what it tells us about the past.
Yeah.
Trying to judge them.
Right.
Glorify them, but just trying to understand them. And anytime we can draw a feeling of commonality between ourselves and those whom we study, I think it's beneficial to our work, and I think it's beneficial to us as humans.
I could not agree more. So thank you, Dr. Bender, for being here. Your book, of course, is the 1857 Indian Uprising and the British Empire. Are there any other resources that you would suggest for folks to look into?
Well, I would always, and you did not plant me to say this, but I would always start with their local libraries.
Yes, I was about to say.
I think libraries are a wealth of resources, and also local universities.
Right.
People shouldn't be afraid to reach out and send an email if they have an area of interest. You know, and we have a lot of events and activities taking place at UNCG that the public is generally more than welcome to, and we like that engagement.
Yeah, one of the benefits of COVID is this new virtual world of learning that we have that may not have been as accessible before, and
absolutely
UNCG is part of that too. So thank you so much for being here and talking with us, and I really appreciate your time, and have a great St. Patrick's Day.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity.